on gun violence prevention. This is part of our fall 2016 Friday Forum Lecture series on the issues analyzing the 2016 elections. I am your host for the day. My name is Casey Emlin. I'm an Associate Director here at the University of YMCA. We're so glad to have you all. I'd invite you all to take a look at the series brochures on the welcome table. It has our complete schedule for this series. They look like this, or maybe they look bigger, depending on which one you've got. We'd like to thank all of our series co-sponsors for financially supporting this program. You can find a full list of those sponsors on the back of their card or at our website, universityymca.org. Sign language interpreters are available for any speaker in our series as long as we have a couple of days' notice. If you or someone you know could use those services, please contact our front desk and we'd be happy to arrange that. Friday Forum is rebroadcast on Web 90.1 Community Radio, as well as live stream, which we are currently doing, and then we put those up on YouTube. So if you ever can't make a talk, you have lots of options to be able to watch the talk later or at the same time, but somewhere else. After the presentation, we'll begin a question and answer period using this remote microphone. Please talk uncomfortably close into the microphone. It is the only way it will pick up your voice. It is the only way that John will hear your question, and it is the only way we'll get it on those recordings. We appreciate your cooperation with that uncomfortable reality. If you need to leave during the presentation for class or another reason, please feel free to discreetly slip out. If you are here for some form of credit, please make sure that you sign in on the sign-in sheet, which will circulate around the room. It is also available at the front. One last announcement from me. While you're here today, we'd like to encourage you to step next door to Murphy's Gallery, which is also on the first floor, and take a look at the work of Chicago artist Candace Hunter. In her exhibition, Hooded Truth, referencing the hoodie, she explores the history of Blackness in this country and related themes of social inequality, violence, and incarceration. This is part of our Artist Revive program, which shows work which explores important topics and adds to the conversation at the Y in a creative way. And with that, I'd like to bring up the chair of the Friday Forum Committee, Nancy Dietrich, who's going to introduce today's speaker and has one more announcement for you.
Thank you, Casey. As many of you know, the Y is more than just a building that houses the Friday Forum. All of us, staff and board, all work tirelessly to bring you these fantastic programs here, all while building student leaders that make a tremendous impact in our community. This fall, we are trying to raise $145,000 that will provide critical support for these programs, and the great news is that we're almost halfway there. If you would like to support the Friday Forum and all that the Y does, I invite you to join me in making a gift to the Y. It's really easy to do with our new dip jar, and it's out on the front table out in the hall. All you have to do is swipe your card in and you'll make a $10 gift to the Y. Or if you work at the university, consider designating the Y in a charitable giving pledge form this fall. And we also have more information on the front table about that as well. So thank you so much for your support. And now I'd like to introduce today's speaker, John Gruber. John is currently an organizing manager for the Brady Campaign and Center to Prevent Gun Violence and is based in Chicago, Illinois. His focuses are on Brady's Stop Bad Apple gun dealer campaign, which focuses on reforming the 5% of gun dealers that sell 90% of guns recovered at crime scenes nationally. Brady's rapid response work to tragedies such as Pulse and on engaging communities most impacted by gun violence. Prior to joining Brady, Gruber worked for Governor Daniel Malloy as a regional field director in Bridgeport, Connecticut on a successful re-election campaign in 2014. Before Connecticut, Gruber worked for Organizing for America in Cleveland, Ohio on President Obama's re-election campaign. Please welcome John Gruber.
It is really great that all of you came out today for a topic that can be so heavy and somewhat divisive as gun violence prevention. I want to say really quickly that it's so great to see members of Moms Demand Action here. They have a really great local chapter, And I will be around after this to answer your questions, but if you want to get involved locally and do things that matter right here, you should go sign up. I know they're very organized, and I know they brought a sign-up sheet to get your information, so they will probably take that. So as you guys heard, I work for the Brady Campaign to Prevent Gun Violence, and I am an organizing manager based in Chicago. I actually don't just stay in Illinois. I cover our target states, so South Carolina following Mother Emanuel, Florida following Pulse, Nevada where we have a background check initiative, and then Maine where we also have a background check initiative. So what I do is basically help engage communities like this, organizing and getting them involved. And what I want to talk about today are kind of the general big picture of gun violence, but then also really hone in on Illinois and Chicago. And I know that you guys are not in Chicago, but I think Chicago really represents the perfect storm of the problems that we have with our gun laws in this country and the need to reform them, whether it is through legislative action, whether it is through actually going after the bad apple gun dealers that are polluting Chicago's streets with guns, or whether it is some mix of the two, which is what our gun dealer licensing campaign is all about. So I want to start with the breadth of gun violence in America. Alright, so one of the interesting things that's happened is that gun violence has been pushed to the forefront of our consciousness. And we think that's partly because of social media and partly because of just the shock and awe that happened following Newtown. So before Newtown, this movement had kind of shrunk, right? We passed the Brady Bill in 1994, but following Newtown, there was renewed interest and renewed, enthusiasm for reforming our gun laws. It took on a new political life and it's taken on a new sense of urgency because Newtown brought what happens when we have irresponsible gun laws and irresponsible guns falling into the hands of bad people into our living rooms in a very personal way and help jumpstart Brady and help found Moms Men Action and all these other great groups that are doing this work. So I wanted to kind of show that it's not just a legislative or political issue. It's turned into more of a health issue. The American Medical Association is calling this a public health crisis. And I think that shows the severity of what we're facing. I mean, we're facing 30,000 gun deaths a year in the United States, 33,000 gun deaths, and 91 every single day. So if you think about it, I mean, that is a huge number of people that are losing their lives to guns, not even talking about how many are injured by guns, or how many guns are out there legally just waiting to be used in active violent crime. So one of the other things that I'm sure you guys turn on the news or any other information, you see is Chicago. Why is Chicago so bad? And Chicago is just this epicenter of this terrible crisis in America. And so there is this website, and I am not trying to be profane, it's called Hey Jackass, and I would recommend you write it down. Because what it does is it analyzes all of the different sources of guns in Chicago, all of the different places that it happened, so how many on the south side, how many on the north side, how many guns were used by people that had a misdemeanor. It can tell you every analysis possible about this gun violence that's happening in America, or in Chicago. And so right now, and as this is out like 10 minutes ago, a person is shot every 2 hours and 2 minutes, and a person is killed every 11 hours and 42 minutes in Chicago. So if you think about that, that's pretty bad. So when you hear the term used Chirac, I mean, if you think about it, there are about as many people getting killed in Chicago as there are in some days in Iraq. So, it becomes kind of like a war zone. And working in this movement, I think is really important if you want to understand what we're doing to look at Chicago again as this epicenter of a perfect storm of gun violence, and there are ways to fix it. So we know that gun violence kills about as many people as traffic accidents. You see vehicular, firearms, falls, drowning, and fire. So those are sources of death to kind of put it in perspective for you. And then an interesting thing is suicide accounts for 2/3 of gun deaths. So when people say, and a lot of people in NRA and the far-right political spectrum a lot of times say that mental health is the big problem. And one of the misperceptions about what Brady and other gun violence prevention organizations say is we don't disagree with that. We absolutely agree with that. We absolutely agree with that, and we absolutely believe that we need help with mental health, but mental health is a part of the problem, it's not the entire problem. So while we want to increase funding for mental health, I think we obviously see that as important, we want to increase funding for mental health reporting so that people that have mental health issues have that reported on the background checks that they go on when they try and buy a gun. We also see that there are other laws that we need to fix to help reduce gun violence. So one of the things that is pretty obvious is that more guns equal more gun violence. And so if you look at the number of guns per capita and you look at our country, you can see there's an overwhelming amount of guns, or an overwhelming amount of guns causing an overwhelming amount of death. So we know that those are kind of correlating and we want to figure out why. Or we know why, we want to figure out solutions to it. Another interesting part of the gun violence problem in America are that guns are an integral part of domestic violence. So more than half of women murdered with guns or killed by family members or intimate partners. Domestic abuse victims are 6 times more likely to be killed if there's a gun in the house. Domestic violence assault with firearms are 12 times more likely to result in death. Female intimate partners are more likely to be murdered with a firearm than all other means combined. However, in safe universal background checks, 38% fewer women are shot to death by intimate partners. So the lesson here is that gun laws, again, do work if we do them on a state level, but they only are so effective. And we're going to go into that later. But if you look at domestic violence, that's one of the key issues in this movement, because it's not just people shooting people. There's a concrete core of gun violence, and part of that is domestic violence. It's something that this movement is addressing, and it's something that we need to look at when we're formulating policy and laws. It's something that in Illinois we are actually working on, and I will talk about that legislation later. So the means matter. So guns are used in more than half of all successful suicides, even though they account for less than 10% of attempts. So the lesson here, you can read those statistics, the lesson here is if you have a gun, you're more likely to be successful when you try to commit suicide. I mean, that's pretty common sense, but if you'd be surprised how many suicides could have been prevented and where there were strong warning signs. And I mean, part of this is veterans, right? And PTSD. I mean, you look at Chris Kyle, who was murdered by a man who was mentally unstable. He had PTSD, and he still was able to access a weapon. And you also look at a lot of cases where parents, significant others said that person's a danger, but they have a gun, and I can't do anything about it. So again, you have to look at how these guns are used in suicides, how these guns get into the hands of these dangerous people, and how we can help that prevent from happening, or if it's too late, how we can intercede in a way that doesn't violate their rights, but also doesn't pose an imminent threat to the rest of society. So the other big part of this is the stuff you see on the news. And in this movement, it's really interesting to see what catches the kind of goldfish attention of our news media and what doesn't. So an example would be that after Charleston, Mother Emanuel Massacre, I'm sure everyone here remembers that, right? Like, it's pretty big news. A guy in Ohio killed 8 family members that he tied up in his basement, right? With a gun. But we didn't hear about it. But the thing is, there is this focus on mass shootings, right? So when we look at mass shootings, we want to look at exactly how many mass shootings there are, and it kind of puts in perspective the scope of this problem. There are 372 mass shootings in the U.S. in 2015, killing 475 and wounding about 1870. So if you look at that, I mean, there are a lot of mass shootings that aren't, all over CNN. And that's another issue that we look at when we're trying to formulate legislation. So how do guns get into the wrong hands? And how do they go into the hands of people we all usually have? So one of the big things that we like to kind of dispel is that there is no factory, there is no gun company, there is no organization that only creates, manufactures guns that are sold to criminals, right? All guns start off legally made, they start off legally sold, or not legally sold, they start off at a legal dealer, and they somehow cross from the line of being legal to illegal, right, and getting into the hands of very dangerous people. So if you look at this graphic, we see background checks are required at gun stores, so brick and mortar. Background checks are required, but at private sales they're not, and they go to a criminal, right? If I go to a gun store, I buy a gun from someone else, and I'm like just standing there while they're picking up the gun, right? And they have the gun and are looking at it, and then I buy it under my name. That's also how it goes to someone that's dangerous. Now, if I go online in Indiana, Missouri, Wisconsin, and I say I want to meet someone at Wendy's and buy a gun off of them and do a private transfer, that is totally legal. So we look at that as kind of like when you go to the airport, right? It'd be like if you go through one line with security and one line with no security, which one do you pick? If I'm a person that knows I can't get through security, I'm gonna go to the one that doesn't have security, and I'm gonna go through it, and I'm gonna become a dangerous person. Oh, one thing I forgot to say was that about 40% of gun sales go unchecked, and that means they go through without a background sale. And then 1% of gun dealers are responsible for about 60% of prime guns. And we're going to go into some of the notorious gun dealers in the United States, when we call our bad apple gun dealers. But it's pretty interesting to see that there are conduits to the illegal market, conduits to gun smugglers that are happening through what are called legal gun dealers, even though they're bad apple gun dealers. And then another issue that is actually rising in prominence because of some of the controversies going on right now are the stolen guns. So 200,000 to 500,000 guns are stolen every year. And part of that problem is how do we formulate legislation that helps go after stolen guns? So whether that's loss from reporting guns that are stolen, or whether it's stronger penalties, there are a lot of different answers to that problem that we can talk about at the end of the question and answer. So one of the interesting things that I think kind of helps frame this conversation is looking at gun laws in the United States and kind of the national problem. Because if you look at it as a state problem or a city problem, you're only going to get a piece of the picture. So in New York and New Jersey, which have some of the strongest gun laws in the country, more than 2/3 of guns tied to criminal activity were traced for out-of-state purchase in 2014. That goes also for Illinois, it goes for Connecticut, and it goes for Puerto Rico, which has like some of the strongest gun laws in the country. And it's because we don't have a national background check system. So the gun laws I have in Illinois might be wonderful, but they only go to the border of Illinois, and on the border of Illinois is Chicago only, right? So if I want to go to Indiana, all those gun laws change. I can go buy a gun, bring it back to Chicago, cause mayhem. You know what I mean? So we have to look at the bigger picture here when we're talking about gun laws. So gun laws in America. So there are 225 years of federal gun laws. The ones I think are most pertinent today are the Brady Background Check Act, which was signed in 1994 by Bill Clinton. That act basically set up our background check system as we have it today. So John Doe comes up to me at a gun store, and he has to give me his information on a form. And what we do is we run that form, and that form checks against mental health history and arrest history, and then in certain states, other prohibiting factors. So in California, the domestic violence standard is much higher than in other states, or in some states, drug penalties are higher than other states. So the states have some input, but there's a federal background check minimum that all gun stores must comply with. Now in 1994, the internet wasn't that big of a deal, right? Like it wasn't something that we used for e-commerce all the time. It wasn't something that we used to do a ton of research and meetups and all that stuff. So in 1994, they said brick and mortar businesses. So what that means, though, is that if I'm not a brick and mortar business, if that means if I'm an online seller like armslist.com, or I am a gun show, I can still sell guns without a background check through a private purchase or through a private transfer, which basically means I can transfer to you without having to do any kind of background check. Now, certain states have eliminated that, including Illinois, but there's still a huge gun violence problem because that law is not the law there. The other interesting piece of legislation is the TR Amendment. And the TR Amendment is the biggest enemy of people that are local and want to do something locally about gun violence, because what it does is if someone shoots me, the information on where that gun came from is not publicly, the police are not allowed to publicly release that. So it basically creates an inhibitor of people finding out where crime guns are coming from in their community. And so one of the things that Brady has done is we've actually gone around the TR Amendment because there is a rider in it that says you can release aggregate trace data. So what we can do is we can release where the guns are coming from. We can't release where specific guns are coming from. So the TR Amendment is a huge problem when we look at how do we stop gun violence crimes locally by going after the gun stores that are giving them out locally. And in Chicago, again, we have a really cool opportunity to go and actually change that because they have actually circumvented the TR Amendment. And they've actually not circumvented, they've actually used what is available in the TR Amendment to create a report. And then the last thing is PLACA. And I don't know how many of you folks watched the Democratic debates this spring, but there was a huge controversy over PLACA. And PLACA basically is the Protection of Lawful Commerce Arms Act. It was passed by Republicans, signed by George W. Bush. And basically what it does is it protects the gun industry and gun dealers from a lot of lawsuits. So if you look at how we reform other industries, through lawsuits, through defective product lawsuits, through lawsuits of misuse of products, we're able to reform them and pass laws and set standards that hold them accountable. FLACA creates a kind of immunity for the gun industry, and that it makes it very hard to sue them and therefore reform them or hold them accountable for the products that they're selling. So one of the things I think many folks remember that after Newtown there was this big push. It was President Obama and Joe Biden, Gabby Giffords, all these people coming out and saying, we're going to pass background checks, we're going to do this. This is a pretty easy thing to do to prevent some gun crime. Now background checks don't prevent all gun crime, they prevent some gun crime. And so what we wanted to do, and what I think the majority of Americans wanted, was to pass background checks on all gun sales. There were other things on there, like the assault weapons ban and not a few other things, but background checks were the main one, and that vote failed. And the reason that it failed is because Republican obstructionism, but then there are also Democrats that voted against it, and there were Republicans that voted for it. So it wasn't necessarily entirely partisan, it was more along the lines of who has the most gun industry money in their pockets. And so right here in Illinois, you have Senator Mark Kirk, who actually voted for it, and who supports it. And his opponent, Tammy Duckworth, also supports it. So you have senators in Illinois that are very good on gun violence prevention. But you have Democrats like Heidi Heitkamp from North Dakota who oppose it. So you have kind of crossover on this issue, but it still failed. So right now we do not have universal background checks. So then this summer, I'm sure everyone saw the news about Pulse. And so after Pulse, there was this renewed outrage, this renewed sense that we needed to do something. So both Republicans and Democrats came forward with limited bills that would either expand background checks or they would stop people from, they would ban you on the terror watch list from being able to buy a gun. So no fly, no fly, or no fly, no buy was the name of that legislation. And all of them failed. So on the Republican side, there were very weak proposals for this, so there were a lot of exceptions. You could appeal it. On the Democratic side, they were more hard-hitting. All of them failed in the Senate. And they were all voted down within like 2 hours, because I was in the Senate gallery for it. It was pretty awful. So I want to go back to the TR Amendment again, because the TR Amendment is really pertinent to our discussion today. Because when you look at the gun violence problem in Chicago, and again, it's kind of emblematic of the country, what Chicago did is from 2010 to 2014, they took all the guns that were traced, that could be traced from Chicago streets that were used in crime, and traced them back to their gun store and state and of origin. And so what they did is they released this report, right, that not only labeled the states that contribute the most guns to the gun violence problem in Chicago, but also the gun stores. So we in Chicago actually have a very clear picture of where the guns are coming from that are fueling the violence on the south side, what percentage of the guns they are, and how we can go after them. It becomes kind of very clear when we want to talk about legislation or protests and things like that. So the TR Amendment is very important to know. It's important to know that President Obama opposes the TR Amendment. The TR Amendment is a great example of what happens when people are paying attention to what the government is doing. The TR Amendment was proposed by a guy named Tier from Kansas. He was like a 2-term congressperson, entirely funded by the NRA. He passed this and left Congress, and now he's a lobbyist. So, I mean, it's an example of like corrupt government. And basically, the whole reason for the TR Amendment was that people were understanding where the guns in their communities were coming from. So they were starting to get hold of, hey, my friend Susie got shot. Let me ask where that gun came from. The police were telling them. And the NRA and the gun lobby were like, this is not good for business. So they went, found this guy, who passed this amendment, and boom, done. So what are public attitudes about gun violence? So the majority of public supports gun safety reforms, including background checks. 93% of Americans, 90% of Republicans, and 82% of gun owners. So the other thing, the other statistic, and this varies because it's very hard to poll NRA owners, but I think it's like 67% of NRA owners support expanding the Brady bill, or what we call Brady background checks, to all gun sales. And the problem with polling NRA members is that they don't release their list. So if I buy a gun, it's easy for me to join the NRA. So what we do is we look at that, we look at people that have bought guns, that have shown some sort of activism in the gun movement, and then we try and pull that. But that's a little skewed when we get those numbers. So let's talk about Illinois, really specifically. So the question that I think is interesting is, doesn't Chicago have the strongest gun laws in the country, but also have the highest gun violence problem? The short answer, yes. But that's not necessarily a result of the laws that are in Illinois compared to other places. It's a result of a lot of different factors. So in Illinois, we have closed the background check loophole. So if I want to go to a gun show in Illinois, I still have to have a FOID card. And the FOID system is really interesting. So it's part of concealed carry. So in Illinois, unless there's a no gun thing, I'm sure you guys go to college here, so you've seen that. There is a no gun sign on a lot of places. You can carry concealed weapon. But as part of that, you have to go through an extensive background check and get a FOID card. And basically, to do a gun, purchase a gun in Illinois, you have to present that FOID card. So even though Illinois has concealed carry, they also have what we call permit to purchase, which means that to have a gun, you have to have a permit in Illinois, which is different than what a lot of people think is registration. You don't have to register every gun you buy, but you have to have a license to buy that gun, which closes a lot of the loopholes that we see in other states. Again, the Chicago Tracing the Guns report pointed out some very interesting facts, though, when we look at the gun violence problem. 60% of the guns used in Chicago's crimes come from out of state, 40 come from in state. So this is part of the report, and this shows the gun dealers that are supplying, the top 4 gun dealers supplying guns to the streets of Chicago. So they are in Cook, and the rest are they're all in Cook County actually, and then one is in Indiana. So these gun dealers are what we call bad apple gun dealers. And these 4 gun dealers, by the way, are part of the more than 500 gun dealers in the greater Chicagoland area. So Chicago has great gun laws, so none of these gun dealers are actually in Chicago. It's almost impossible to have a gun store in Chicago. They sit right outside on the border of Chicago, right? And the one that I think is really good for our discussion today is called Chuck's Guns. And over the course of 4 years, it sold 1,516 guns used in crime. So more than 1,500 crime guns in 4 years. If you think about it, that's close to 1 gun a day used in Chicago crimes. So we want to talk about how this is happening, how we can prevent it from happening, and the question arises, why is Chuck so different? Why is Chuck's, or any of these gun dealers, so different than the gun dealers around them that are not selling these guns in such high quantities, right? And so when we look at things like gun dealer licensing, our Stop at Apple gun dealer campaign, we look at how do we go about reforming them, engaging with them, and trying to stop them from continuing to sell these massive amount of crime guns. The second thing that's really interesting is the states that surround Illinois that sold the guns are 60% of the guns are coming from out of state. So the biggest one is obviously Indiana, and the mayor of Chicago's folks like to joke that they want to run a crop dusting plane and fly over Indiana and just drop this report everywhere. Because, I mean, they sold 3,000 guns, almost 4,000 guns used in crime, and it's because Indiana sits, 20 minutes outside of Chicago, right? And an important thing to know is that if I buy a gun in an Indiana gun show and take it to Chicago, and I use that gun to crime to replace it, that gun is counted as a total for Indiana. So it looks like a lot of those guns are being bought from gun shows without background checks and sold in record numbers to people that we all agree should have guns that aren't using the point system and going through Illinois. The other thing that's interesting here is that 8,000 guns are sold in-state. And when we look at that number, we say 17% of those guns are the 3 gun dealers within Illinois, 3 bad apple gun dealers, so Chuck's, Westport, and Midwest gun dealers. And so 17% of that are the guns that are coming just from these 3 gun stores. So people ask me, how are they around the point system? Is it really the gun dealer? And you have to look at what these gun dealers are doing in comparison to other gun dealers. And you have to look at the straw purchasing problem that we have, where people are going in and buying guns. So the gun lobby and its limits. So most gun laws don't work. That was Marco Rubio's response to us trying to push him to expand background checks to all those. The idea is that most criminals don't follow the law. They just go and they buy guns other places, from their friends out of trunks of cars. Our question is, how do we let them get into the trunks of cars in the first place, right? And how do we prevent that? So you're wrong, Senator Rubio. States with stronger gun laws have lower gun death rates. The problem isn't that criminals don't follow laws, but rather that criminals are dissuaded by weak laws, and gun laws in all but a few states are decidedly weak. In one survey, incarcerated felons who did not carry weapons during the commission of their crimes were asked why they decided against being armed. 59% chose response against the law. The other thing I want to go back to, really, that I think is really interesting here, is that Iowa has pretty good gun laws. I'm going to step away. Iowa, I mean, hopefully you know where Iowa is right next to Illinois, right? And you see that they sold 211 guns. Whereas all the other states around them sold much higher amounts of guns, right? So good gun laws do work, but they don't work as well if they're constantly surrounded by states that have terrible gun laws. So Iowa sold more gun laws than Texas, but Texas is much harder. The other gun myth. The only way to stop a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun. That's Wayne LaPierre. He's such a interesting guy. He really likes to lie a lot. So this graph is really cool. It's a little small, so I'm going to read it to you. So how active shooter incidents end. The FBI studied 160 active shooting incidents between 2000 and 2015. 40% of shooters ultimately committed suicide. So that's 64 out of the 160. 28.1% law enforcement and shooter exchange fire, so law enforcement helped end the crisis. 13.1% unarmed citizens safely and successfully restrained the shooter, so that's where that myth comes in, right? And then 3.1% armed citizens exchange gunfire with the shooters. So one of the interesting things that happens is after mass shootings, they interview all the people that were there. And in some cases, a lot of them are armed, right? But you look at what law enforcement says is the best thing to do, and the best thing to do is to evacuate, right? Not to start shooting, because when law enforcement comes in, they don't know who the shooter is, right? There's nothing on me that says, hey, I'm the mass shooter. It's, hey, everyone's shooting their guns, who are we going to shoot? So law enforcement actually asks you to leave in order to take cover, not to start trying to flood their gun and shoot other people. Particularly because panic sets in and you can miss, there's all kinds of things that can happen. So what are our solutions to all these problems that we're talking about, whether it's the Tracing the Guns report or it is the fact that we don't have universal background checks. And this is where these wonderful multi-colored handouts come in, multiple handouts. And we can kind of start talking about the solutions and policies in Illinois and Chicago and nationally that makes sense for solving our gun violence crisis. So the first is to expand Brady background checks. So as we saw in Illinois, a lot of the guns, the majority of the guns being used in Chicago are coming from out of state. And so what we could do is we expanded Brady background checks, right? We made all states like Iowa, which has done something similar to Illinois, and closed the gun show loophole. We would actually be able to really reduce the amount of guns that are trafficked from state to state, from state with bad gun laws to state with good gun laws. A very interesting thing is that in New York, the majority of crime guns don't even come from the northern part of the country. They come from South Carolina, North Carolina, and Georgia, and are smuggled up the coast. So if we could just, and that's because South Carolina, North Carolina, and Georgia have terrible gun laws. So if we could just reduce some of those crime guns, or change some of those laws, we could reduce the trafficking of crime guns. We can educate folks about the real dangers of guns. So how guns and PTSD are not necessarily a great idea. Keeping guns out of the hands of children. And I know that Moms Demand Action has a really great program called Be Safe that really focuses on parent-to-parent conversations. Brady has something very similar called the Ask Campaign. It's basically a social pressure campaign. So we're not trying to demonize you if you have a gun. That's not the point of what we're trying to talk about. We're trying to say if you have a gun, be responsible. Lock it up. Make sure your kid can't get to it. Make sure that you have a gun lock. All those things that are very simple steps that can help prevent a tragedy. And it's a very important program. If you want to learn more, definitely talk about that too. And then our Stop Bad Apple Gun Dealers campaign. So going after the 5% of gun dealers that we sell 90% of crime guns nationally. So finish the job. So since the Brady Law went into effect in 1994, background checks have stopped more than 2.8 million gun sales for prohibited purchasers, including convicted felons, domestic abusers, fugitives from justice, and other dangerous individuals. Millions of guns are sold every year with no questions asked transactions, so that's online, via private transfer, or gun shows. Experts estimate that 40% of guns now sold in America are done without a Brady background. So that's something we definitely need to change if we want to reduce the gun violence problem nationally and in Chicago. And then our bad apple gun dealer program, and this is the thing that I'm probably going to harp on. So 90% of guns used in crimes was a profit, just 5% of gun dealers. 86% of gun dealers sell not one crime gun. And so when we look at that, we have to look at why, right? It's again, this huge glaring why. What are they doing differently? Why are these gun dealers the ones that either all the criminals are just like, hey, this is my favorite gun dealer to go to, or they're doing something different, right? And then it only takes one bad apple. So irresponsible, reckless, illegal practices, selling to stop purchasers and traffickers, and selling off the books. So the Stop Bad Apple Gun Dealer campaign is interesting because it doesn't try and necessarily go and shut down these bad apple gun dealers. We try to reform them, right? We're not anti-gun, we're anti-illegal gun. So our solution is to talk to the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, who are supposed to regulate gun dealers in this country, and say, what do most responsible gun dealers that never sell a crime gun do, right? And then we can talk to these gun dealers and say, hey, if you do these things, you can help prevent gun crime in your community. Seems pretty common sense. So here's our gun dealer code of conduct. So videotaping all sales, 1 gun a month, no default proceed, screening employees, so background checks on employees, assisting law enforcement in investigations, so keeping accurate records of the guns they sell. I mean, this is what most, like, if you go buy the really delicious Thai food over there, they have receipts of all the things they've sold all day, right? So why not gun dealers? And then be alert for signs of disrupt purchase. So when we look at that code of conduct, we have gone to a lot of different gun dealers all over the nation, and 2 of them in Illinois, and said, hey, can you adopt this code of conduct? And the gun dealers told us, and I'm going to put this nicely, get lost, kick rocks, never come back, we hate you. And so we tried to look at, well, what can we do to reform them? So one thing that we know is that gun dealers are only regulated by the federal government in Illinois. So in some states, gun dealers have certain restrictions that are imposed on them by the state and the federal government. In Illinois, they are only regulated by the federal government. So what we wanted to look at was, is there legislation that could take components of this code of conduct that we know that ATF says most responsible gun stores already employ and help prevent gun stores from selling guns to people that shouldn't have them, and put that into legislation. And so we did. It's called Gun Dealer Licensing. And so Gun Dealer Licensing is the support of the Gun Dealer Licensing Act that you all have. And it goes over the problem. I think the most glaring and interesting thing is that in Illinois you have more gun dealers than you do McDonald's, right? And in Illinois, if I want to get my hair cut, I have to go to a barber. That barber is licensed by the state and inspected by the state and held to a certain ethical standard by the state. Gun dealers are not, right? So why should gun dealers be exempt from being held, licensed by the state, regulated by the state? And we have this gun violence crisis going on. We know that 17% guns used in Chicago crimes are coming from just 3 gun dealers, right? And that's only in Chicago. So that's not talking about the Southland, that's not talking about Peoria, that's not talking about certain parts of Illinois that are experiencing bigger gun violence problems. So what we wanted to do is we want to look at what is the legislative components of that. So we introduced a bill called the Gun Dealer Licensing Act. And what it would do is require background checks on all employees, transparency and accountability. So they would have to have they would have to have a reporting standard for lost and stolen guns. So like if I'm a gun dealer and I'm like, oops, that gun went missing, I'd actually have to report that, because right now that isn't up to law. Training, so training on how to do background checks, making sure that their staff is trained, making sure that the gun store owner is trained on how to be a good business person for selling guns, and doing best practices. Video surveillance and security requirements, so videotaping the premises, making sure that your employees, again, are not bad people. I mean, if I have a kid and I want to take that kid to daycare, I have to do a background check on the people who are taking care of my kids, but I don't have to do a background check on the gun dealer that's selling guns. It doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. And then business location restrictions. So we don't want gun dealers next to schools, which I think is pretty common sense legislation. So what we did this year is we pushed it, and we got a lot of support. We have a gun violence prevention coalition in Illinois. And so what the goal is, again, is not to solve the entire gun violence problem, but is to stop these 3 gun dealers, but also to stop all the rest of the bad apple gun dealers. So if we can change Illinois legislation, we can really cut down the gun violence that's happening here locally, right? Because you already have good senators on this issue, and you have pretty divided House representatives that, you know, the Republicans are very anti-gun violence prevention, and we're getting all the Democrats we can get, and a Republican up north near Chicago. So what we really want to do is focus on state legislation as a means of cracking down on bad apple gun dealers. And I think the interesting thing about this legislation is it was bipartisan. So we did get bipartisan support. We had certain Republican state representatives supporting us. We got it out of committee twice, so the Judiciary Committee handles this legislation. We got it out of committee twice, and it got a vote on the floor. It did not pass. We were looking at this as a 3-year project. So within 3 years, we want to pass this legislation and better regulate gun dealers. So that's all I'm going to say about that. I want to go to the question and answer portion, because I'm sure I've got some questions coming. So the other thing we can do is ask and say the kids campaign, and again, that is really about guns in the home, and if you want to learn more about that, I definitely encourage you to talk to Moms in Action. They have a lot of great information on it. The last thing I want to talk about is back to Titus Credit. So, state gun law victories, and this is not actually readable, but the point is that we actually have momentum at our backs. So when you hear about a tipping point in the movement, I encourage you to think about LGBTQA rights, right? When you think about the fact that, 10 years ago was marriage equality like a conversation we were having? Not really strongly, right? We had President Obama getting nudged on the issue, right? And now it's, you see every politician on the left and the right running to support LGBT rights, right? So we know that there are movements that have followed this same trajectory. And sadly, after the mass shootings at Pulse and Newtown and Charleston, we have this opportunity to really make some changes. And we know that the best changes we can make following the marriage equality model is on the state level. So in Illinois, we really need to pass gun dealer licensing, because then we can go after the bad apple gun dealers in Texas and Missouri and South Carolina that we know are selling a lot of crime guns through licensing at the state level. So the other thing that I think is really interesting when you look at the politics of the issue is how much guns have become part of the national conversation on the presidential campaign trail. So Hillary Clinton has always been with us. Hillary Clinton was part of the original Million Mile March in 2000, right? She's a long-time gun violence prevention supporter. But most mainstream Democratic politicians were not. I mean, I love our president, but when he was an Illinois state senator, he didn't do much on gun violence prevention, and he didn't do that much when he was senator, right? That's because guns were seen as a toxic issue. It was very hard for Democrats to come out on this issue. Now Democrats are racing to embrace it. You even saw Bernie Sanders take back his support for PLACA and say, hey, I'm now supporting the repeal of PLACA. So you see even people that were more moderate on those stances saying, hey, we really need to do something in this country. You also see Republicans, right? We just flipped 2 Republicans in Florida that at following Paul said, you know what, enough is enough, I want to support expanding background checks. So the tide is turning, and you're seeing people really kind of embrace this issue. It's something that we need to take care of, and it's become mainstream politics. The other thing is, I don't know if you folks saw, Chris Murphy's one of my heroes because I have connected ties. You saw that filibuster that happened, and John Lewis sitting in on the floor of the House with the Democratic majority, and actually your senator, both of your senators actually went down and supported him. And I think Mark Kirk was the only one Republican to go down there. But it's really interesting because this has really unified the Democratic caucus. So and some of the Republicans. So if we can kind of continue this pressure, if we can continue calling our legislators and voting on this issue, Moms in Action every time on the street saying gun sense voter, and it really is vote on gun issues, because a lot of people vote on single issue voters, whether that's taxes or you think one candidate's better on jobs. Factor this into your voting and tell the people that you're voting for, this is what I'm voting for, and they're politicians. They want your vote. They will talk to you about it, and they might adopt a position that's actually more towards the mainstream. So how you can help. So join a local chapter organization. So Brady has 90 chapters all around the country. I know Moms in Action has a lot of chapters too. Join the Illinois Gun Violence Prevention Coalition. So there's a coalition of groups that have Brady, the Illinois Council Against Handgun Violence, certain parts of Moms Demand Action, Gabby Gifford's group. We're all working together in unison because one thing that we know about this movement, and one thing we know about the NRA is really effective at being the voice of gun owners, right? They're really effective at being the voice of the gun movement. We want to have that same effective voice here in Illinois, so we create this coalition where we all work together, we support each other, and I really encourage you volunteering for any one of those organizations. They actually do good. They go out and they actually try to get some change. Spread the word through social media. So I know a lot of us know that one friend that's like constantly ranting about things on Facebook, and they're like really annoying. And I'm not saying become that person because then you'll just turn off everyone. But I think having intelligent debate is good for this issue, right? Because there's a lot of misinformation out there. And I think one of the biggest pieces of misinformation is that we want to ban guns, we want to overthrow the Second Amendment. I mean, you just heard Donald Trump say Hillary Clinton wants to take away everyone's guns. I don't think Hillary Clinton's ever said that. And even in 2008, she ran on a very moderate platform on guns, right? So we have this misinformation that's spread by the NRA, and they're so good at getting their people riled up. The challenge for people that believe in this issue is getting equally riled up and getting equally mobilized and organized. So that is one of the things that you can do. Lobby your elected officials to support gun dealer licensing. So down here you have a state rep named Carol Ammons, who is amazing on this issue. She voted for gun dealer licensing. She's great. But go in and remind her of that. Or go in and talk to her and say, hey, who can I lobby? What can I do? Because your state representatives, I guarantee, hear 10 times more from the other side than they do from us. And it's because the other side is using fear, and we're using hope. And sometimes fear is more mobilizing than hope, and we want to do that. Lobby your elected officials for write a letter to the editor, so that's a very easy thing you can do. There are a lot of resources for that online. Testify or attend a public hearing. So when we were doing gun dealer licensing this year, we had first time thing happen. We got over 1,000 people across the state of Illinois to slip in support of gun dealer licensing. Now the NRA beat us and they got like 4,000, but this is the first time that's ever happened. And that's because we got people aware of this issue. We actually started mobilizing and organizing as a coalition. And so there will be moments where you can go and testify, even at the local level, on an ordinance that would, ban guns from being 270 feet from school. But get used to talking about this issue in a public arena and educate yourself. I mean, there are fact sheets for Brady, Moms Demand Action, the Illinois Gun Violence Prevention Coalition that you can use to educate yourself. And the thing is that I think discourages a lot of people is you don't have to be an expert, right? Legislators are going to write the legislation. That's their job. That's why they're elected. Your job is to give your opinion, and whether you're young people or whether you're just a person in the community, they value your opinion. Lobby your elected official on gun dealer licensing. You can tell there's a theme. We really like this legislation. And vote for candidates who support gun safety. So when you vote this year, look at where every candidate that you can vote for that can legislate. Look at where they sit on gun dealer licensing or any other piece of legislation that's important to you. Because if you have those conversations, you tell them that you're voting on it, you might get a very interesting response. And the last thing you can do, and I know almost all of you have cell phones, is take out your phones right now and text Illinois 877-877 so that when things happen in Illinois, we can let you know what's going on. And we can say, hey, here's a link to the gun dealer licensing thing. Can you click on this link and slip in support of it and just say, I support gun dealer licensing. It's that easy, right? And the thing is, the other side is really good at this. The other side has this people. So I'm an organizer, right? And as an organizer, I envy the NRA because they are so good at getting their people to commit and to do these things. And so we need you to do this really quick action. Text Illinois at 877-877. We won't blow up your phone all the time. But what we will do is tell you when important things are happening. Because the point is to get folks aware and mobilized. So with that, I'm going to go to questions really quickly. I want to just tell you what these things are. So you can be aware that this is a comparison of HR 3411 and 1217. These are the two bills in the United States Congress and the House of Representatives that would expand Brady background checks to all gun sales. So these are two different ways of going about it. One of them is a more of a compromise bill that has more Republican co-sponsors. The other one is a pure bill, so it doesn't give the NRA some goodies to get Republicans on board. But it does actually close all the loopholes, and that is the one that we call Brady 2.0. This is one that we're very interested in pushing next session, and that we've got a few Republicans signed on to. The second thing is the gun dealer licensing fact sheet. So it tells you what gun dealer licensing does, lists all the organizations that are involved, gives you more information, sources that you can look at. And the last thing is our Stop Bad Apple Gun Dealer campaign. So if you're interested in learning more about these bad apple gun dealers, please take a look at it because it's really informative. It kind of gives you the general overview of the campaign nationally, which I did go into so much because we can talk about this issue forever, but I don't want to go on for too long. So with that, I would love to take questions.
You mentioned BLACA without saying what that was, and that's the thing that gives gun manufacturers no liability for how guns are used. I was wondering whether that could be considered for these bad apple gun dealers, whether they can invoke a higher liability if they. And the other thing is, you didn't say anything about the gun show loophole. Did I miss something? Has that been resolved?
Yeah, well, the gun show loophole in Illinois has been resolved by the court system. Nationally, it has not. And the gun show loophole is really the online loophole because we see arms list as a huge purveyor of guns. So the online loophole, gun show loophole, same thing, different terminology. PLACA, yes, we can use them to go after bad apple gun dealers. We can use them to go after the manufacturers, right? If the manufacturers say to gun dealers, hey, we don't want to get sued, so you got to do all these different things to make sure you're not selling guns to bad people. That is a way to keep them in check and keep the gun industry in check because the manufacturers don't supply the public; these gun dealers do. So it's a way to keep the manufacturers. It's a way to have the manufacturers hold the gun dealers responsible. Right now, PLACA is very much in force. And Brady has a legal action project made up of lawyers that represent victims of these guns. And a lot of our cases do get thrown out, but we actually have had some recent successes. So that's a very good question.
So I'm wondering about.
Yeah, it's kind of
Okay. I'm wondering about the relationship between the federal government and the state government in terms of gun laws. It's the Second Amendment of the Constitution that gives people the right. But we see great variation here that seems to be one of the big problems is a number of states have very weak laws. I'm assuming the reason, first of all, I'm interested in the relationship. It sounds like states can regulate and have passed laws. The federal government can too. If the federal government has a law, I'm assuming all the states have to abide by that. Is the issue now when you're working in states because there's no way right now the federal government is going to be passing anything? Or I guess I'm just wondering about this relationship federal versus state government.
That is a great question. So I think it's like a three-part question. So I'm going to go through all three parts. The first thing is the preemption, right? So under the Constitution, the federal government has a law, the state can't pass a law contradicting that, right? So one of the things that we look at is concealed carry reciprocity. So that's something the Republicans and the NRA really, really want. Because what it would do is say, I'm a concealed carry permit holder in Arizona. Every single state in the United States, whether you have concealed carry or not, whatever your concealed carry restrictions are, you must honor that, right? So we have that fear on the NRA offense side. On the NRA defense side, or where we're playing defense, on our offensive side, what we look at is, yes, it would be great because a lot of states have rolled back different forms of background checks. So what we want to do at the federal level when we have a good favorable Congress and a favorable president is actually pass expanded background checks to all gun sales and roll back PLACA, right? Because then there are a lot of state immunity laws too. So Indiana has really terrible immunity laws for gun dealers. So gun dealers in Indiana, it's very hard to sue them. In California, it's not. So those variations in states are good and bad for this movement. Like for example in Illinois, right? If we got rid of the point system, or we had permitless carry, that would be terrible because then people would be able to walk around with guns, get guns however they want without background checks, and without any type of permit or regulation at all. And so bad people would get their hands on guns. And then the other things, I think you were talking about the Second Amendment. I mean, again, going back to it, none of these things are challenging the Second Amendment. And we know because of the Heller decision that the Second Amendment, we cannot ban people from having guns, right? But what we want to do is just want to make sure the responsible ones get guns and the irresponsible ones don't.
I thought it was really useful what you said too about fear, unfortunately, tends to be more mobilizing than hope. And I think it's interesting too to try to meet people in terms of like talking and having a good conversation with opposition to these kind of ideas. and that people aren't really motivated by fear, and then trying to sort of meet them where they're at.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, as you presented here, and all evidence I've ever seen agrees with that, you're putting yourself at risk if you bring a gun into your house and store it in an unsafe manner. But if you wanted to have it potentially for the dubious idea of defending yourself in your house, waking up in the middle of the night, reaching for a gun, you'd have to have it readily accessible and loaded, all the things that are not a good idea. You should keep the gun separate from the ammunition with trigger locks, ideally. All these things that ultimately, oftentimes, lead to suicide, as you've noted. So the suicide issue seems like a very good place to start having a conversation.
Yes.
And I saw that the Christian Science Monitor just had a really good article about that. And it was about gun stores in New Hampshire. And they were having things that were very reasonable, like if someone is depressed or so on, you probably wouldn't want to sell them a gun. Waiting periods might be a good idea. We get sort of these reasonable ideas that are about protecting gun owners themselves, where sometimes, the ideas of fear of crime, which fortunately we've had less discussion about, law and order and crime, fear-mongering and political advertising lately, although it's come back a little bit now. That, crime is at an all-time historical low. That's the good news. If you ever wanted to buy a gun for self-protection, this is like the least likely time to do it. But however, you see more people buying guns now saying it's no longer for sport and hunting, which are very much under the decline, but for personal protection. So, other things I think to bring up is, where in the conversation something, and this sounds very mundane, pepper spray. You want to have, if you have a feeling of fear, whether that's grounded or not, you can't argue with whether or not people feel afraid. You want something tangible. Think about the culture of this, something tangible to hold on to, something that you have. You can buy pepper spray. It's highly effective for most things, and the consequences of wrongly using it are not lethal. When there's shooting in a school, people talk about why weren't teachers armed and so on and so forth. It seems a bit crazy. You run into some problems with that too, even with insurance companies. I'm hesitant to admit it, but my home state is Kansas, and right now they have a governor who's sort of rivaling our governor here in Illinois in terms of bad ideas. But yes, so getting signal, moving on. So the idea of the insurance companies wouldn't want to insure schools because it's liability if you have a lot of people harmed there, so that doesn't work either. But positions that meet people where they are about their fears, but then point out, reasonable ways to react to those fears.
Yeah, so one thing I forgot to mention, I'm so glad you asked that question, is a really great piece of legislation we have here in Illinois that has bipartisan support. It's called Legal Violence Order Protection. And a really great example would be, if I had a son who lived in my basement, and he just broke up with his girlfriend, and he's having a really tough time. I know he has guns. He's super depressed, won't come out, acting out, drinking too much, doing all the things that make me very worried. I know he has a gun, right? Am I going to go in there and try and take it from him? No, because he has a gun. But what it does is allows the police to go in and take that gun from him, and he's a prohibited purchaser for just 2 years. After that, he gets his gun back, he gets his rights back, he can get his FOIA card back. But we just want to make sure that he's not a danger to himself or society, because he could go and shoot his girlfriend, he could go shoot me, he could shoot himself, and we don't want any of those things to happen. And that is a bill that has passed pretty bipartisanly for this type of legislation in other places. I know that it's in New Jersey, it's in California, and they're working on it in a lot of different places because it's also a domestic violence issue. So legal violence order protection is a great bill. It's part of what the coalition works on. So we will send you updates about that if you saw it. Yeah.
So when it comes to like bad apple gun dealers and then also like criminals, there's obviously like a big mutuality of interest between the criminal gets the gun way easier without having to go through all these hoops and problems. And the gun dealer, I imagine, also has an incentive, like an economic incentive.
Yeah.
It's not as hard. So my question for you was, do you think that there would be anything that we could do where instead of only focusing on punishing them, which obviously will work, and holding them responsible and accountable, like videotaping sales, besides from that, do you think that maybe there would be anything in terms of like giving them an economic incentive to be more responsible, maybe in terms of like a positive reward or anything like that? Do you see potential in that?
I mean, the thing is like, and I like to talk about Chuck's gun because Chuck's gun is the most egregious offender. Chuck's gun sits on the south side of Chicago, and entering suburb, if you look at like Chicago, there's the Dan Ryan, which is like a U, and then it's like right in the middle of it, so it's like very in the heart of the south side of Chicago. And Chuck's gun says, I can't help it that I just happen to sit here and sell all these guns to people, right? But there are tons of other gun dealers nearby in the South Suburbs that don't. So Chuck, as you said, knows who their clientele are. And one of the things that we know is from having prosecuted these cases, there was a gun dealer in Wisconsin called Badger Guns that actually was trafficking guns to people that went and shot cops in the face. And so we were like, how do we not go after this gun dealer? This gun dealer clearly did something wrong. They were selling guns to no-shot purchasers. And what we found out is that the employees were aware of that, right? The employees were aware of what they were doing and who these people were. So they were actually committing a crime. But how do we prove it, right? We proved it through the videotaping while sale, through videotaping outside of the gun dealer. And we don't have that type of capability with Chucks, right? So what we tried to ask Chucks to do is, hey, can you work with police? Can you install these things? Chuck said, no, we're not the problem. The people are the problem. It's not our fault that they go and shoot you. The other thing is you know who your clientele is when you are selling anything. If I'm selling perfume, right? I'm gonna know who I sell perfume to. These people know, hey, this guy's coming in and buying 2 guns a day, every day. What can he be doing? Is he just hanging them up on the wall? No, he's trafficking, right? And so it's actually having to be able to hold them accountable. So the incentive for them not to do it is that, hey, it's actually illegal to do that. So it's actually very illegal to straw purchase a gun in Illinois. They just signed a legislation that made it even more illegal. But the problem is, how do we prove that? And we prove that through videotaping all sales, having police inspections. Right now, I want to inspect Chuck's guns on the federal government. I have to tell them out there I'm coming, right? So that's like you having a house party when you were too young to have a house party. And your parents say, hey, we're coming home. And you're like, okay, crap, I'm going to clean it up and then go back to doing what I was doing later, right? So it's the same logic. So there's not a real incentive for them to do the right thing other than it's super illegal. And if we can get it, we can get millions and millions of dollars out of that in a lawsuit. Chris.
I'm a gun sense voter, and I'm pleased to be, I feel uplifted by being part of Mom's Manufacturing. People in this community should be looking forward to an opportunity to speak to the candidates for local office when the leader of the voters and the police host a series of candidate forum opportunities in the communities. And we'll have an opportunity, for example, to question Senator Bennett and his opponent, not the other, some of the other public government, but I've heard from the head of the League of Women Voters that Rocky Davis has declined the opportunity to speak in the forum that was originally scheduled. They still got the room December 27th. By the League of Women Voters rules, if one candidate declines to speak, there's only one other candidate. The mic isn't offered to the one candidate. So we want to have an opportunity to hear Rodney Davis speak on the record for how his position of medicine stacks up against our victims. And I urge you to communicate, email or phone Congressman Davis. And if you have some suggestions for what we might ask Senator Bennett and his opponent, other than how they feel about gun ownership laws, it's another good question we should ask.
Yeah, I would ask them how they feel about expanding background checks, right? He's running for Congress, right?
State Senate.
Oh, state Senate. Okay, that makes sense. So I would ask them definitely about how they feel about gun dealer licensing, LVOP, so legal violence order protection. Those 2 bills are really important. And then there are other things coming up around sentencing reform in Illinois that I don't think have been introduced. I think if they are introduced, they'll be introduced on the House side. So I would ask about those. So how they feel about sentencing reform for gun convictions, because there's a strong current right now, I'm sure folks are aware, Black Lives Matter and this whole idea that, there are people being incarcerated overly much, and there are some crimes that are not getting prosecuted at all. So a lot of people that commit gun crimes are walking free very soon after. So how do we change that too? So that is a really good question. So yeah, those 3 things.
Hi. Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. Thank you, John, for the great overview of everything. I was asked to just speak a little bit about how you can get involved in Mom's Hand Action here. I don't want to take the thunder away from you, but so you do not have to be a mom to be part of Mom's Hand Action. It's kind of a Funny name.
Could you speak from the
Oh.
mic? Come on up.
Sure.
Please, thank you.
Hi. Okay, that's better. So
it doesn't start.
oh yeah. You don't have to be a mom, as I said, to be part of Moms Command Action. You don't have to be a woman or any of these things. Just show up if you're concerned about gun violence. We have an active chapter here in town. We've been around for about a year, although the organization nationally has been around for about 3.5 years. And we get together and just basically take actions, whether it's being part of rallies or writing letters to the editor or calling our congresspeople and letting them know what we want from them. You can get involved with us. We meet every month, the first Wednesday of every month, so that next meeting is October 5th, I believe. We meet at 7:30 on that first Wednesday at the Unitarian Church in Urbana. It's at 309 West Green Street in Urbana, 7:30 p.m., and we'll get you started. The other thing that John mentioned was the fact that we have a campaign called Gun Sense Voter, and Jenny's wearing this shirt. She just mentioned that. If you want to get involved and pledge to be a Gun Sense voter, meaning you'll take this issue into consideration when you go to the polls in November, then we can help you out with that if you text the word pledge to 64433. So I encourage you to certainly text Illinois to 877-877, but also text pledge to 64433, and that'll bring up a little form that you can fill out to pledge your support for the Gun Sense voter platform. And if you have any questions for me, I'll be around, but thank you so much for letting me have this opportunity.
Okay. Thank you for the presentation. So one of the main issues that you discussed was stolen guns.
Yeah.
And it seems like a lot of this legislature actually stopping the bad apples wouldn't help that, and a lot of the background checks wouldn't help that. So I'm wondering, what's the likelihood of some sort of biometric controls? Because it seems like that would solve the
Smart
stolen
guns.
problem.
So
any
that's
efforts in that direction, or is that like since you can't even get the easy stuff, you don't even think about it?
No, that's a great question, and that's on the forefront of the work that I know my colleagues are doing in DC and all the other parts of this movement are working on with the administration. So the first thing is that lost and stolen guns is part of bad apple gun dealers, because there are a lot of cases where I'm a gun dealer and Joe comes in and I'm standing at the counter and Joe says, I'll have one gun, and I write down two, sell one out the back door, and say, oh, we lost the gun, oh no, or hey, he has it, and then it's based under his name, and then he reports it's stolen. So how do we take into those bad apple gun dealer practices that often contribute to traffickers, straw purchasers, that kind of thing. So cracking down on bad apple gun dealers by videotaping all sales and actually having accurate records of what you're selling and when you're selling it does help, because if you're, and also mandatory reporting of lost and stolen guns is part of that. So it is that for gun dealers. When we talk about the stolen gun component of biometrics, and you talk about fingerprints unlocking guns, or the rings they used to have that would unlock guns, so they did try to do that in I think it was the early 2000s, and there was a big pushback from the gun industry. And I wonder why. Well, if guns are stolen, it's just like a car, right? The car industry depends on you eventually crashing your car, giving it away, whatever, to continue to buy a new car. Gun industry wanted the same thing. So the gun industry really opposed it. But right now the Obama administration is looking at smart gun technology and looking at it from a law enforcement perspective, right? Because they want to be able to have law enforcement people not to worry about people taking their guns when they're out and using them against them. So how do we get that? And I know there's a lot of testing going into it. If you look at the film Under the Gun is just an amazing resource. If you're interested in this movement, it's really well done. It's somewhat funny. It talks about Moms Command Action. It talks about Brady. Gives you this whole wonderful overview, much better spoken than I am. And it's a movie that basically talks a big portion of it about smart gun technology. And what it boils down to is there isn't the appetite among the gun manufacturers to do this, and there isn't necessarily the appetite among a lot of the American public, because they don't know about it, right? They don't know they exist, so there's no legislation, right? The other thing is procurement. And procurement is something that a lot of organizations have tried going after. So procurement's the idea that we use our purchasing power to only, as cities and municipalities, only go to gun dealers, or only do things that, or go to gun dealers that we know are not selling guns to dangerous people, that type of thing. And that's what President Obama would be able to do if we did have a reliable, tested, verified, foolproof, safe way to actually use smart guns in for police. So that would be the procurement portion of that. So it's on the cutting edge. And I'm going to be partisan here and say, hopefully, if we get Hillary Clinton administration, she will continue to push that. I would be very skeptical that if we get a Donald Trump administration, he will push people to adopt smart gun technology.
There we go. Please join me in thanking John Gruber for joining us. We talk about campaign finance reform and all such up until and after 1 week after the election.
I'm ugly.
You look good. We got this one.
I didn't realize how long that was.
Yours didn't work? I hit it.
No, it was good. I double checked. No.